Sir, that belongs to
Sir, I
someone
need
who
you to
earned
step
it.
aside for a
The
moment,
words
please.
came too late.
It's just
The
a memory
small wooden
box.
box
We
had already
understand, sir.
slipped
Thank
from
you for your
Officer Dylan
cooperation.
Brooks' hands and
Do you
struck
have
the
a story
polished
behind
airport
this?
floor with a sharp crack that echoed
Yes, it
across the
belongs to my
security
father.
checkpoint. Every nearby conversation seemed to pause
I
at
recognize
once.
him. Stop.
A few travelers turned their heads. Others slowed their steps. A
Sir,
purple and gold medal rolled
just
from the
wait.
open
Leave it to
box,
me.
spinning across the bright tile beneath the cold white lights of Terminal C.
Sir, step
Dylan
aside,
watched it
please.
move for a second before letting out a
What is this
short
about?
laugh. Everybody's a hero these days, he muttered. A couple of people
Carry on,
nearby
sir.
exchanged
Thank you for your
glances.
service.
One man
I
smirked.
didn't know.
Another looked away. Standing on the other side of the inspection table, Marcus Walker said nothing. He simply watched the metal spin in a widening circle until it finally settled near the edge of a gray rubber mat. His weathered hands remained at his sides. His shoulders stayed straight. He wore an old brown jacket, faded blue jeans, and a pair of well-worn boots that had clearly seen more years than most people in the terminal. To Dylan, he looked like just another elderly traveler holding up the line. To everyone else, he barely seemed noticeable. The security area buzzed with the usual sounds of rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and distant conversations. Yet somehow the silence around Marcus felt louder than all of it. Dylan reached into the wooden box again and began sorting through its contents without asking permission. An old photograph, a folded letter, a military patch faded by time. "You carrying all this for a reason?" he asked. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was calm and steady. "Yes, sir." Dylan glanced up. "Mind sharing?" Marcus looked toward the medal resting on the floor. "Not really." Dylan leaned back slightly. "That's convenient." Behind Marcus, the line continued to grow. Some passengers shifted impatiently. Others watched with curiosity. A young woman holding a coffee cup lowered her phone. An older man wearing a baseball cap narrowed his eyes. Marcus remained still. There was no anger on his face. No frustration. Just a quiet patience that seemed strangely out of place amid the tension. Above them, sunlight poured through the massive airport windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. The light caught the edge of the metal and made it shimmer briefly. Marcus noticed. So did Dylan. "Military?" Dylan asked casually. Marcus nodded once. "A long time ago." "Uh-huh." Dylan picked up the folded letter from the box. The paper was yellowed with age. The corners were soft from years of careful handling. "What's this?" Marcus took a slow breath. "Please be careful with that." Something about the request seemed to irritate Dylan more than it should have. His jaw tightened slightly. "It's a piece of paper." Marcus did not respond. The line behind him had gone almost completely quiet now. The tension was no longer about security procedures. It was about something harder to define. The look in Marcus's eyes. The way he stood there. The way he seemed more concerned about a fragile old letter than about being embarrassed in front of hundreds of strangers. Dylan unfolded the paper halfway. "If this stuff is important, maybe you should explain why." Marcus looked at the letter for a moment. The noise of the terminal seemed to fade from his ears. The sunlight touching the paper. The worn edges. The familiar handwriting. Memories stirred behind his eyes like distant thunder. Then he quietly answered, "Because some things are worth more than people realize." The words lingered in the air between them. "Because some things are worth more than people realize." Dylan Brooks stared at Marcus for a moment, then shook his head as if dismissing the answer altogether. He placed the letter back onto the inspection table with far less care than Marcus would have preferred and glanced toward the growing line. A scanner beeped somewhere nearby. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Life continued around them, but Marcus felt himself drifting somewhere else entirely. His eyes settled on the wooden box. The scratches along its edges were familiar. He had carried it across the country more times than he could count. Through airports, through train stations, through hotel rooms, and quiet mornings at home. 35 years had passed since he first received it, yet every mark on the wood still told a story. The box had belonged to another man once. A man named Samuel Harris. Marcus could still remember the first time they met. Fort Campbell. Summer heat rising from the pavement. Two young soldiers standing outside a barracks building, pretending not to be nervous about what lay ahead. Samuel had been the one to break the silence. He had offered a handshake and a joke that was not particularly funny. Somehow they ended up laughing anyway. Over the years that followed, the friendship became something stronger than either man could explain. They shared long deployments, cold nights, endless miles, and the kind of trust that only forms when people rely on each other completely. Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. Samuel always carried a notebook. He wrote letters constantly. To his wife, to his daughter, to anyone he missed. Even during the busiest weeks, he somehow found time to write. The folded letter resting on the inspection table was one of those letters. The last one. Marcus had never been able to throw it away. Across from him, Dylan continued examining the contents of the box. To him, they were just old objects. A medal, a photograph, a letter, a patch, forgotten pieces of someone else's past. But Marcus knew better. Every item carried a life inside it. Every scratch and crease held a memory. The photograph showed two young men standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright blue sky. Both were smiling. Both looked far younger than they realized at the time. Samuel had his arm slung across Marcus's shoulder. They looked like brothers. Dylan picked up the photograph and studied it briefly. "That you?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Dylan looked at the second man. "Friend of yours?" Marcus's gaze softened. "The best one I ever had." For the first time, Dylan seemed unsure how to respond. The answer had come too quickly, too honestly. A woman standing nearby quietly lowered her suitcase handle and continued listening. An older traveler folded his arms. Even the impatience that had filled the line earlier seemed to be fading. Marcus noticed none of it. He was still staring at the photograph. His thoughts carried him back to a small cemetery outside Nashville 3 months earlier. Rain had fallen that day too. Not hard, just enough to leave tiny droplets on the polished stone markers. Samuel's daughter had stood beside him after the ceremony. She was nearly 40 now, a mother herself. She had handed Marcus the wooden box with trembling hands. "Dad always said you would know what to do with these," she told him. Marcus had not trusted himself to speak. He simply nodded. Today was the first time he had opened the box since then. The first time he had looked through everything inside. The first time he had allowed himself to revisit memories he had spent decades carrying quietly. A flash of sunlight poured through the terminal windows again, illuminating the faded photograph. Marcus could almost hear Samuel's laughter. Almost hear the stories. Almost hear the promise they made to each other so many years ago. Never forget. Never stop showing up. Never leave a brother behind. The sounds of the airport slowly returned. Wheels rolling across tile. Distant conversations. Overhead announcements. Marcus blinked and looked down at the inspection table once more. The medal remained where it had fallen. The photograph rested beside the letter. And somehow, standing in the middle of a crowded terminal filled with strangers, he felt closer to the past than ever before. The longer Marcus stood at the inspection station, the more Dylan Brooks seemed determined to prove something to everyone watching. He picked up the military patch and turned it over in his hand, as though he expected to find a secret hidden beneath the faded stitching. The overhead lights reflected off the metal inspection table, casting pale shadows across the scattered contents of the wooden box. Around them, travelers continued moving through the terminal, but many slowed their pace. Curiosity had begun replacing impatience. A mother holding a young boy paused near the edge of the line. A businessman carrying a leather briefcase stopped pretending to check his phone. Even a pair of flight attendants walking toward a nearby gate exchanged glances before quietly watching from a distance. Dylan noticed the attention. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. There was something about having an audience that made him stand a little taller. He adjusted the badge on his uniform and looked toward Marcus again. "You said this trip is important." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. Important enough to carry all this." Dylan gestured toward the medal, the photograph, the patch, and the letter. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Very important." Dylan leaned against the inspection counter. "You heading to a reunion or something?" Marcus looked past him toward the giant windows overlooking the runway. Several aircraft sat beneath the bright afternoon sky. Ground crews moved between them like tiny figures in a vast sea of concrete and steel. For a moment, he seemed far away. Then he quietly said, "Not exactly." Dylan waited. Marcus offered nothing more. The silence irritated him. He preferred quick answers. Simple answers. The kind that fit neatly into categories. But Marcus Walker did not fit neatly anywhere. The old veteran carried himself with a calm dignity that Dylan could not quite understand. There was no nervousness, no defensiveness, no attempt to impress anyone. That confidence made Dylan suspicious for reasons he could not explain. "You know," Dylan said, folding his arms. "Most people would just answer the question." Marcus looked back at him. "Most people are not carrying the same memories." The words landed softly, yet several nearby travelers heard them. A woman standing near the rope barrier lowered her gaze. An elderly man in a navy cap slowly nodded to himself. Dylan frowned. He felt the mood around him shifting and did not like it. He glanced down at the photograph again. Two young soldiers smiling beneath a summer sky. One had already become familiar. The other remained a mystery. What happened to him? Dylan asked. Marcus studied the photograph for several seconds before answering. He kept a promise longer than most people do. Dylan raised an eyebrow. That is not really an answer. It is the only one that matters. The airport announcement system crackled overhead. A boarding call echoed through the terminal. Somewhere in the distance a child laughed. The ordinary sounds of travel continued, yet the space surrounding the inspection table felt strangely separate from the rest of the building. Marcus could feel dozens of eyes on him now. Still, he remained composed. Deep inside his jacket pocket rested a folded invitation. Thick cream-colored paper. Gold lettering. He had looked at it every day for the past month. The invitation was the reason he was here. The reason he had finally opened the wooden box again. The reason he had chosen to revisit memories he usually carried in silence. Dylan never saw the invitation. Instead, his attention settled on the purple heart medal still resting near the rubber mat. He pointed toward it. You have not even picked that up yet. Marcus followed his gaze. Sunlight touched the medal once more. The purple ribbon seemed almost luminous against the polished floor. Marcus took a slow breath. Some things deserve a moment before you touch them again. Dylan shook his head, clearly unconvinced. Yet before he could respond, movement near the far end of the terminal caught the attention of several travelers. Heads began turning. Conversations softened. A group of uniformed military officers had just entered the security area, walking with quiet purpose toward the checkpoint. Marcus had not noticed them yet. Dylan had not either. But within seconds, everything was about to change. The subtle shift in the terminal spread faster than any announcement. One traveler noticed the approaching officers first, then another. Heads turned one after another until a quiet wave of attention moved across the security area. Dark blue uniforms. Dress shoes polished to a mirror shine. Distinguished insignia catching the afternoon light. The group walked with calm purpose through the terminal, speaking little as they approached the checkpoint. Dylan Brooks finally noticed them when a nearby employee suddenly straightened his posture. He glanced toward the entrance and immediately recognized that these were not ordinary travelers. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. He quickly set the photograph back onto the inspection table and adjusted the collar of his uniform. Marcus remained unaware. His eyes were still resting on the purple heart lying near the rubber mat. For a brief moment, he considered bending down to retrieve it. Instead, he left it where it was. The medal had spent decades in a wooden box. It could wait another minute. The approaching officers continued forward. Their conversation was quiet, professional, unhurried. They seemed focused on reaching a nearby gate farther down the terminal. Dylan noticed several airport employees watching them now. The attention made him increasingly conscious of the scene unfolding at his checkpoint. He looked at Marcus again. The old jacket, the worn boots, the weathered hands. None of it matched the image Dylan associated with military prestige. In his mind, respected veterans looked different. They traveled differently. They carried themselves differently. Marcus did not fit the picture he expected. That assumption had guided every interaction since the moment the wooden box appeared on the inspection belt. Dylan cleared his throat. You still have not told me why you are traveling. Marcus looked up. His face remained calm. I am attending a ceremony. What kind of ceremony? A military ceremony. Dylan glanced at the contents of the box. For your friend? Marcus nodded. In a way, the answer only frustrated him further. Every response seemed wrapped in layers he could not easily access. There was no argument to push against. No attitude to challenge. No mistake to expose. Marcus simply answered what he chose to answer, and nothing more. The crowd continued growing. A woman near the rope barrier quietly whispered something to her husband. A college student removed one earbud and listened. An elderly veteran wearing a navy cap had not moved for nearly 5 minutes. He stood watching Marcus with an expression that suggested he understood far more than anyone else present. Dylan pointed toward the folded invitation partially visible inside Marcus's jacket pocket. What is that? Marcus glanced down. The cream-colored paper had shifted slightly when he moved. For a moment, he considered keeping it hidden. Instead, he carefully removed it and placed it on the inspection table. Dylan picked it up immediately. Gold lettering reflected beneath the overhead lights. His eyes moved across the text. The confidence in his expression began to soften. Not disappear, just soften. The invitation was not ordinary. It carried official military seals, formal signatures, specific names. Names that meant little to most travelers but carried enormous weight within military circles. Dylan read one line twice. Then a third time. Marcus watched quietly. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. He still remembered opening the envelope at his kitchen table. He had stared at the words for nearly an hour before believing them. Not because the invitation was unexpected, because the recognition behind it had taken so long to arrive. Dylan lowered the paper. "You were invited personally?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." "Buy them." Another nod. Before Dylan could ask another question, movement behind the approaching officers suddenly drew attention. Someone else had entered the terminal through a secured access corridor. Several airport employees immediately recognized him. Their reactions were subtle but unmistakable. Conversations stopped. Postures straightened. Even the officers walking toward the checkpoint adjusted their pace. Marcus had not seen the man yet. Dylan had not either. But within moments, the entire balance of the afternoon was about to shift in a way neither of them could possibly expect. The atmosphere around the checkpoint changed before anyone fully understood why. It started with small details. An airport supervisor, standing near a security podium, suddenly straightened his posture. A pair of officers near the terminal entrance stepped aside without being asked. Conversations faded into murmurs. The movement spread outward like ripples across water. Dylan Brooks followed several travelers' gazes toward the secured corridor. A tall figure emerged from the far end of the terminal, surrounded by quiet professionalism rather than spectacle. There was no announcement, no entourage demanding attention. Yet people noticed immediately. Years of leadership carried a presence all its own. The man moved at a measured pace, accompanied by several senior military officers, who seemed careful to match his stride. Sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows behind them, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Dylan stared for a moment before recognition finally registered. He had seen photographs countless times. News interviews, military ceremonies, official briefings. This was General Henry Caldwell, one of the most respected military leaders in the country. Dylan instinctively adjusted his uniform again. Nearby airport employees did the same. Even travelers who did not know the general's name could sense his importance. Meanwhile, Marcus remained focused on the items scattered across the inspection area. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the wooden box. The old photograph, the folded letter, the purple heart lying on the floor. His attention never left them. The approaching group continued moving through the terminal until one of the officers walking beside the general suddenly slowed. His eyes had settled on something near the checkpoint, something familiar. He whispered a few words to another officer. Both men looked again. Then a third officer noticed. Within seconds, several members of the group were quietly studying the inspection area rather than the path ahead. General Caldwell sensed the shift immediately. Leaders often noticed attention before they understood its cause. He followed their gaze toward the security checkpoint. His eyes moved across the crowd, across the inspection table, across the scattered contents of the wooden box. Then they stopped. The general's pace slowed. One of the officers beside him glanced toward Marcus and looked genuinely surprised. Another appeared, almost stunned. Dylan noticed the reactions and suddenly felt uncertain. Until now, he had controlled the situation. Every question, every instruction, every decision. But something had changed. The confidence that had carried him through the encounter began slipping away. He looked down at the invitation still resting on the inspection table. The official seals, the signatures, the names. For the first time, he wondered whether he had misunderstood the situation entirely. Marcus finally became aware of the unusual. Silence. He looked up. Travelers were no longer watching him alone. Their attention had shifted beyond him, toward the approaching officers, toward the general. Marcus followed their gaze. The moment he saw Henry Caldwell, something flickered across his face. Not surprise. Recognition. Deep recognition. The kind built across decades rather than years. The general stopped walking. The officers around him stopped as well. Nobody spoke. The terminal seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Marcus remained where he stood, calm, still, his weathered hands resting beside the wooden box. Across the polished floor, the Purple Heart remained untouched, catching a thin beam of sunlight. General Caldwell's eyes moved from the metal to the photograph, from the photograph to the folded letter, then finally to Marcus Walker himself. The general's expression changed instantly. Whatever he had expected to find at this airport checkpoint, it was not this. Around them, travelers exchanged confused glances. Dylan could feel the tension building, but did not yet understand why. He only knew that every officer standing beside the general now seemed focused on one man. An elderly veteran in a worn brown jacket, standing quietly beside a battered wooden box. And for the first time that afternoon, Dylan Brooks found himself wondering whether he should have listened more carefully from the beginning. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The terminal remained filled with people, rolling suitcases, and distant announcements. Yet an unusual stillness settled over the checkpoint. Sunlight poured through the towering glass windows and stretched across the polished floor like liquid gold. Marcus Walker lowered his eyes from General Caldwell and looked instead at the Purple Heart resting near the edge of the rubber mat. The metal seemed small compared to everything happening around it. Small and quiet, much like the men it had once represented. He took a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of coffee from a nearby kiosk, and jet fuel drifting in from the runways beyond the glass. Around him, travelers waited. Security officers waited. Military officers waited. But Marcus was no longer standing inside an airport. Not entirely. His attention drifted back through the years. Back to another afternoon beneath another sky. He remembered heat shimmering above dusty ground. He remembered laughter carried by the wind. He remembered Samuel Harris sitting on the tailgate of a truck, writing yet another letter home. Samuel always wrote letters. Some were long. Some were short. Some contained stories that made no sense to anyone except family. But he never missed an opportunity to remind the people he loved that they mattered. Marcus could almost hear his friend's voice now. Calm, steady, uncomplicated. The memory settled over him like a familiar blanket. Nearby, Dylan Brooks stood silently for the first time all afternoon. The questions had stopped. The assumptions had stopped. Even the restless energy that had driven him earlier seemed to have disappeared. His eyes moved from Marcus to the metal and back again. He was beginning to realize that what lay scattered across the inspection area was not a collection of objects. It was a lifetime. A lifetime he had reduced to inconvenience without ever understanding it. Marcus slowly bent down. The movement was unhurried. Careful. His knee creaked slightly with age. The polished floor reflected his silhouette beneath the bright afternoon light. His fingers reached the Purple Heart at last. For a brief moment, he simply held it in his palm. The ribbon had faded over time. The metal carried tiny scratches collected across decades. Yet it remained beautiful, not because of its appearance, because of what it remembered. Marcus gently brushed away a speck of dust with his thumb. His expression never changed. There was no anger in his face, no resentment, no desire to embarrass anyone, only quiet respect, the same respect he had carried for years. Around him, the crowd watched in silence. A woman near the rope barrier lowered her eyes. The elderly veteran wearing the Navy cap placed a hand over his heart. Even several airport employees seemed affected by something they could not quite explain. The moment required no speech, no explanation, no defense. It existed on its own. Sunlight glowed across the metal and reflected softly onto Marcus's weathered hands. The old photograph remained on the table beside the folded letter. The invitation rested nearby, its gold lettering catching the light. Together, they looked less like belongings and more like pieces of a story that had survived long enough to be remembered. Marcus carefully placed the Purple Heart back inside the wooden box. Then he folded the letter with deliberate precision and laid it beside the metal. Every movement felt meaningful. Every motion carried the weight of memory. Across the checkpoint, General Caldwell continued watching. His expression had softened completely now. The officers beside him remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, because some moments were larger than conversation. Some moments demanded stillness. And as the afternoon light filled the terminal with warmth, Marcus Walker stood quietly beside the wooden box, surrounded by strangers, yet somehow accompanied by every friend he had ever promised to remember. The silence finally broke with the sound of measured footsteps crossing the polished floor. General Henry Caldwell stepped away from the officers accompanying him and walked directly toward the checkpoint. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. The crowd parted almost instinctively, creating a clear path between the general and Marcus Walker. Dylan Brooks felt his stomach tighten. Every step seemed to amplify the weight of the moment. The general was not looking at the airport staff. He was not looking at the travelers. His attention never left Marcus. When he reached the inspection table, he stopped. For a second, neither man spoke. The years seemed to hang between them. Decades of memories. Decades of sacrifice. Decades of promises kept. Then General Caldwell's eyes settled on the photograph resting beside the wooden box. His expression softened even further. "I never thought I would see that picture again," he said quietly. Marcus smiled faintly. "Neither did I." Several officers exchanged surprised glances. Dylan looked from one man to the other, struggling to understand. The general reached toward the photograph, but stopped short of touching it. "That was Fort Campbell," he said. Marcus nodded. "Summer of '86. A small laugh escaped the general. "Samuel convinced all of us that barbecue from a gas station was a good idea." Marcus shook his head. "Worst decision he ever made." A few people nearby smiled despite themselves. The tension shifted. Not gone, but transformed. The general's gaze moved to the folded letter inside the wooden box. The moment he saw the handwriting, his smile disappeared. His eyes lingered there for several long seconds. "He carried that letter everywhere," the general said. Marcus looked down at it. "I know. After all these years?" Marcus nodded once. "After all these years." The terminal remained silent. Travelers who had no idea who Samuel Harris was suddenly felt as though they should know. The letter no longer looked like old paper. The metal no longer looked like old metal. Everything on the table had become something larger, something sacred. Then General Caldwell looked directly at Marcus. The emotion in his eyes was unmistakable. "You actually came." Marcus seemed surprised by the question. "Of course I came." The general slowly exhaled. "Most people would not have." Marcus glanced at the wooden box. "Samuel would have." Those 4 words landed with extraordinary weight. The officers standing behind the general lowered their eyes. One quietly cleared his throat. Another stared at the floor. It was obvious they understood something the crowd did not. Dylan watched all of it unfold. The invitation, the photograph, the recognition, the respect. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clear. The elderly man he had treated like an inconvenience was not merely attending a ceremony. He was part of its reason for existing. General Caldwell finally turned toward the gathered crowd. His eyes swept across the checkpoint before returning to Marcus. Then he said something that caused every officer behind him to straighten immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the terminal. "There are very few people I would interrupt my schedule to greet." He paused. Marcus Walker is one of them. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Dylan felt. The blood drained from his face. But the general was not finished. He looked back at Marcus and continued. "The reason many of us are standing here today is because this man spent a lifetime putting others before himself." The checkpoint became completely silent. Not a single suitcase rolled. Not a single conversation continued. Every eye was fixed on Marcus Walker. And for the first time all afternoon, the story everyone thought they understood had been completely turned upside down. The words hung in the air long after General Caldwell finished speaking. Nobody seemed willing to break the silence. The terminal, once filled with hurried footsteps and distracted conversations, now felt more like a place of reflection. Travelers stood motionless beside their luggage. Airport employees remained where they were. Even the officers accompanying the general appeared affected by the moment. Marcus Walker lowered his eyes slightly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Recognition had never been something he sought. Throughout his life, he had learned that the most important things were often done quietly. The people who served beside him understood that. Samuel Harris had understood that better than anyone. General Caldwell looked at the wooden box again. Then he looked back at Marcus. A faint smile touched his face. "You know," he said softly, "he talked about you constantly." Marcus shook his head with a small laugh. "That sounds like Samuel." Several people nearby smiled. The warmth in the general's voice had changed the atmosphere completely. This was no longer about rank or authority. It was about friendship, loyalty, memory. the kind of things that survive long after headlines disappear. The general carefully reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and removed a folded program. The heavy paper carried the seal of the Department of Defense. He opened it and held it out toward Marcus. "Your seat is still waiting." Marcus accepted the program gently. His fingers lingered on the paper for a moment. The invitation and the program now rested side by side in his hands. Two reminders that promises made decades earlier were still being honored. Today, Dylan Brooks watched from only a few feet away. Every passing second seemed to make him more aware of his own behavior. The assumptions, the dismissive comments, the careless handling of the box. Looking at Marcus now, he felt something he had not expected to feel when the day began. Regret. Not because someone important had arrived. Not because a general had witnessed the interaction. Because he finally understood the human being standing in front of him. The realization settled heavily inside him. General Caldwell noticed Dylan standing there. His gaze moved briefly toward the security officer before returning to Marcus. The general could have said many things. He could have criticized. He could have demanded explanations. Instead, he simply asked, "Did everything get sorted out?" Marcus looked toward Dylan. The younger man immediately lowered his eyes. The crowd waited. The answer seemed important somehow. Marcus glanced at the wooden box resting on the inspection table. Then he looked at the purple heart safely tucked inside. The photograph, the letter, the memories. Everything was where it belonged again. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, sir. Everything is fine." The simplicity of the response stunned several people nearby. Marcus had been given an opportunity to embarrass someone publicly. He refused. He had been handed a moment of power and chose grace instead. General Caldwell studied him for a second and smiled knowingly. The answer did not surprise him at all. It was exactly the response he expected from Marcus Walker. Dylan swallowed hard. The kindness somehow felt more powerful than criticism would have. He stepped forward slightly. His voice was quieter than before. More careful. "Mr. Walker." Marcus turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Dylan hesitated. The words seemed difficult to find. Finally, he managed to say, "I should have treated your belongings with more respect." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he offered a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from a lifetime of seeing imperfections in people and choosing not to define them by their worst moments. Around them, the tension finally began to dissolve. Travelers breathed again. Conversations slowly returned. Wheels rolled across the terminal floor. Yet something had changed for everyone who witnessed the exchange. Because respect had been restored not through authority, but through character. And standing beneath the afternoon sunlight streaming through the giant airport windows, Marcus Walker quietly reminded everyone watching that dignity does not come from titles. It comes from how a person chooses to carry their heart through the world. The boarding announcement for Washington echoed softly through the terminal, but nobody seemed eager to move. The moment had settled into something deeper than curiosity. General Caldwell glanced toward the departure screens, then back at Marcus Walker. A gentle smile crossed his face. "Looks like they are finally ready for us." Marcus nodded and carefully closed the wooden box. The old hinges clicked softly. Inside rested the purple heart, the photograph, the letter, and decades of memories carried across a lifetime. He ran his hand across the worn wood one last time before lifting it from the inspection table. The sunlight pouring through the terminal windows reflected along its scratched surface, revealing every mark left by time. Around them, travelers slowly returned to their routines. Suitcases rolled once more. Conversations resumed. Yet many people continued watching Marcus as he prepared to leave. Not because of the medal, not because of the invitation, because of the quiet way he had carried himself through everything. General Caldwell stepped beside him. Neither man seemed in a hurry. The officers accompanying the general formed a respectful distance behind them. Together, they began walking toward the departure gates. The crowd naturally opened a path. A mother gently touched her son's shoulder and pointed toward Marcus. The boy looked up curiously. Marcus offered him a small smile. The child smiled back. Near the checkpoint, Dylan Brooks remained standing where he was. He watched the veteran walk away, the wooden box tucked securely beneath one arm. The scene felt very different now than it had an hour earlier. The terminal. Lights had not changed. The airport had not changed. Yet Dylan felt as though he had been looking at the world through the wrong lens all afternoon. He thought about the photograph, the letter, the invitation. More than that, he thought about the patience Marcus had shown when patience was not required. He thought about the grace he had received when he probably did not deserve it. As Marcus approached the entrance to the concourse, he slowed unexpectedly and turned around. The movement caught Dylan by surprise. Their eyes met across the distance. For a second, neither man spoke. Then Marcus raised his hand in a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Not triumph, not judgment, just kindness. Dylan felt a lump rise in his throat. He returned the gesture quietly. Marcus nodded once and continued walking. General Caldwell noticed the exchange but said nothing. He did not need to. Some lessons were strongest when left undisturbed. The afternoon sun stretched long golden reflections across the terminal floor. The polished surface mirrored silhouettes moving toward the gates. Marcus and the general walked side by side, two men connected by memory, loyalty, and promises kept. Ahead of them waited a ceremony. Behind them remained a terminal full of strangers who had witnessed something unexpected. Not a confrontation, not a spectacle, something far rarer. A reminder. As they reached the gate entrance,